Agriculture is arguably the original concern of rural sociology. How are people going to feed themselves? What is happening to rural communities when fewer and fewer people are working in agriculture? These were some of the first questions that rural sociologists addressed, and they continue to concern us in the 21st century. Last week, we talked about subsistence and the substantive economy. Well, if there's any substance to subsistence, it's the labor through which food is produced, which for the most part happens through agriculture. If we want an economy that enables human life, it needs to involve agriculture. No question, agriculture is essential. And yet, in industrialized countries like the United States, we find ourselves in a situation where this work is conducted by only a minuscule portion of the population, less than 1%. And although agriculture is essential to the substantive economy, it accounts for only 5.4% of the US gross domestic product. This contradiction is at the core of two opposing perspectives on agriculture. For some, agriculture is comparable to any other industry. Its relevance is measured by indicators such as the market value of its products or its contribution to formal employment. From this perspective, agriculture is indeed tangential, negligible compared to manufacturing or trade. From this view, it would be smart to replace agriculture with more lucrative land uses. What is the value of an acre of farmland compared to real estate designated for residential or commercial development? If we use our substantive definition of economy as the material means provisioning process of human society, we know this is nonsense. Without agriculture, no food. Without food, no human life. Without human life, not even residential or commercial development. You guessed it. I propose that we should look at agriculture through the lens of the subsistence perspective, and in conjunction with the entire food system, from soil to plate, to waste and excrements. But this perspective alone does not by itself promote justice. Regardless of whether we look at agriculture from the subsistence or the money perspective, we need to ask whose interests are being served by different forms of social organization. Slavery was highly lucrative for the slave owners and would have looked great on the balance sheet, but was violating basic human rights of the enslaved workers. Settling America was instrumental for white yeomen and Jeffersonian democracy, but devastating for Native Americans. Local organic food is wonderful for those who can afford it, but useless for those who cannot. Consequently, it doesn't just matter whether we approach agriculture from the base of the subsistence iceberg or from the top, but also whose perspective we center. You see, agriculture is complicated, and this is why we have a whole college here dedicated to the agricultural sciences. Our perspective on agriculture is expressed in the language we are using. Consider the acronym CAFO, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, that Brown and Shaft are referring to in their chapter on agriculture. Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation sounds complicated, so it must be scientific, right? Others call the same operation factory farm, which sounds less scientific, so it must be polemical? I'm here to tell you that there are no objectively right or wrong terms, but different objectives, reasonings, and worldviews behind these different terms. Using a term like CAFO for farms in which animals are confined in tiny cages and treated like machines is a clever way to hide the suffering that takes place in these spaces. Using four nouns lends itself to acronyms in which the term animal is no longer visible. And even if we spell out concentrated animal feeding operation, the term turns animals into objects of economic and scientific rationality, but disguises the industrial logic of this type of agricultural production. We can often recognize the political and philosophical views of someone by the language they use. Someone who uses the term factory farm is most likely critical of intensive animal farming. On the other hand, sometimes we use language that contradicts our views, simply because we're told by people of authority that this is the correct language. In sociology, we call this hegemonic language that is legitimized by people in power, such as the media or college teachers like myself. Limiting the meaning of economy to the money economy, like we discussed last week, is one example of hegemonic language, and using the word concentrated animal feeding operation for a factory farm is another. I don't ask you to abandon using the acronym CAFO, but I certainly don't ask you to learn it or use it either. There's this tendency to think that every acronym or every chain of noun is an important concept that we need to learn. This is not so. More important are the concepts that these terms describe, and it can be worth it to slow down your reading to wonder why someone would use a certain term. By the way, the same applies to the terms that I serve you in this class. Social imagination, primitive accumulation. Why are sociologists using these terms and not other? I leave it up to you to ruminate on this question. A similar problem comes up when Brown and Schaff describe 2/3 of all small farms in the US as non-viable businesses, limited resource endeavors, or retirement or lifestyle residences, simply because they don't provide the family's primary livelihood. Veronica Benholt-Thompson and Maria Mies, reviewing the insights from the field of peasant studies, draw different pictures of these operations. They argue that even when off-farm income exceeds the income from agriculture, the former is usually seen as a secondary income that supplements what the farm produces. People don't farm as a hobby, particularly not those who have been handed down a farm or who saved up for one over many years. People farm because it gives them a sense of security that they can feed themselves, or because they find it the most meaningful occupation that they can imagine. From the perspective of the substantive economy, running a farm provides farmers with more than just monetary income. It is also a place to raise children, a place to pass down knowledge about farming, and a way to feed a community. We know that it is predominantly small farms as opposed to large farms that keep people in rural areas and that contribute to the social and cultural life in rural places. Studies have shown that small, labor-intensive operations promote biological and cultural diversity like large operations cannot. From this perspective, is the viable farm the farm that provides services like biodiversity, a place for families to live, civic life in rural areas, etc.? Or is it the farm in which a farmer does not need to find work elsewhere, but whose need to expand curtails these other benefits, if not for the farm itself, then on the level of the community? Now, I don't like to pitch small farms against large farms. If you know anything about farming, once a farm committed itself to a certain type of operation, in particular capital-intensive row crop farming, it pretty much has to grow to stay in business, just to service debts, lease land, or pay property taxes. I once did a study on farming in upstate New York and found that even the operators of large commercial farms work towards subsistence, but that they feel locked into the system and have to farm in ways they don't necessarily would if they didn't have the same economic pressures. It is important to note that much of these pressures don't have anything to do with farming itself. It is often said that you can't survive on a small farm these days. Well, how is it that for millennia people survived on tiny farms of sometimes less than an acre, and often still do in developing countries? And now with all this knowledge and science we have, we suddenly can't survive on the same land on which our ancestors made their living? We sure could if people owned their land and their machines, and if the knowledge about farming and plant breeding was cultivated in communities, instead of being outsourced to agronomic experts. That farms need to make a certain monetary revenue each year to stay in business has more to do with social order than with agronomy. Let's look at another example of where language matters. Brown and Schaff discuss the gender division of labor in agriculture. On most farms, but not all, farm work is divided along gender lines. You're much more likely to see a man sitting in the combine than a woman. This cultural expectation is so ingrained that even if women or non-binary people drive a combine, they would be regarded as manly. But what I want to point out is the perplexing categorization of feeding livestock, tending calves, running farm business errands, and moving equipment, not to mention housework and childcare, as subsidiary production roles. How is any of this work more subsidiary than driving a combine if no crop would grow without these activities? Wouldn't it be more accurate to say that producing and selling cash crops is subsidiary because it provides the farm with income without which it would risk being foreclosed, but which is not the reason why people farm? Which activities in farming are considered primary and subsidiary depends on our perspectives on the agriculture economy, whether we regard it from the perspective of the money economy or from the perspective of the subsistence economy. That a rural sociology textbook discusses essential activities as subsidiary shows exactly how hegemonic the money-centered view on the economy is, and how little value we attribute to subsistence work. It is here that Benholt-Thompson's and Mies' critique of patriarchal capitalism come in. The authors argue that it is precisely this devaluation of women's subsistence work that led not only to an economy in which money is given more esteem than life, but in which women are relegated to the role of subsidiary housewives rather than independent agricultural producers. As I've said in the beginning of this lecture, the sociology of food and agriculture is an immensely wide field of study, and I cannot possibly touch on every aspect in one lecture. I therefore assigned you the 10th chapter of Brown and Schaft's book, which surveys several trends in US agriculture, such as the history of farming in the US, the globalization of farming, the concentration of farming on fewer and fewer operations, the revival of local food systems, and more. But Brown and Schaft approach agriculture mostly from the perspective of the formal money economy, which is why I also assigned you a section from Benhold Thompson and me's chapter on agriculture, which provides an alternative view on farming using the subsistence perspective. If you find the latter perspective interesting, I recommend you check out the whole chapter, which is linked on Canvas. What I attempted to do in this lecture is to point out the different perspectives that we can take on when studying agriculture, showing that even the most benign sounding concepts and terms involve ideological assumptions. In our society, these assumptions are usually based around the belief that money is more valuable than life, and that the gainful work of men is more important than the subsistence work commonly associated with women. I hope that you can apply this critical lens when you learn about agriculture, both in this class and in other classes here at the College of Agricultural Sciences. Ask, who is benefiting from developments in agriculture, be it the increased industrialization of farming or the revitalization of local food systems? Ask, who are the people and the animals behind acronyms like CAFO? And ask under which conditions agriculture can ensure good, meaningful, and healthy lives for everyone.